May 15, 1990, Portland, Oregon. A city known for its rain-soaked streets and artistic community would soon become the backdrop for one of the most perplexing missing persons cases in the Pacific Northwest. Christopher Anderson, a 47-year-old optical specialist and prism collector, vanished without a trace from his workshop on a quiet Tuesday evening. His wife, Catherine Anderson, reported him missing after 3 days of unanswered phone calls and an empty home. The last time anyone had seen Christopher alive was on the evening of May 12th, when neighbors observed lights burning late into the night at his specialized workshop located in the industrial district of Southeast Portland. "So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from." The workshop itself was a modest building, converted from an old warehouse space. Christopher had transformed it into a sanctuary for his passion. Optical instruments and prisms of every size and configuration lined the walls. Shelves held crystals that caught and bent light into spectacular displays. This was where Christopher spent most of his waking hours, crafting custom optical pieces for collectors, museums, and private clients across the country. When police officers arrived at the scene on May 18th, they encountered something unusual. The workshop door was locked from the inside, secured by a deadbolt that could only be engaged from within. Windows remained intact, showing no signs of forced entry. Officers gained access through a side entrance using keys provided by Catherine. What they found inside raised more questions than answers. The workspace appeared frozen in time. Tools lay scattered across the main workbench, some still positioned as if Christopher had simply stepped away for a moment. A partially completed prism project sat under a magnifying lamp, its edges carefully ground, but the work clearly unfinished. A cold cup of coffee rested near the edge of the desk, a thin film visible on its surface. Everything suggested an abrupt interruption, yet there were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no indication of violence. Detective Sarah Mitchell, a seasoned investigator with the Portland Police Bureau, was assigned to lead the case. Her initial walkthrough of the workshop revealed additional peculiarities. Christopher's personal effects, his wallet, keys, and jacket, remained in the office area. His vehicle sat parked in its usual spot outside. For someone who had supposedly left voluntarily, he had taken nothing with him. Neighbors in the surrounding industrial area provided conflicting accounts. Some recalled seeing Christopher's workshop lights on until nearly midnight on May 12th. One witness mentioned hearing what sounded like heavy equipment being moved late that evening, though this was not entirely unusual given the industrial nature of the neighborhood. No one reported seeing Christopher leave the building. Catherine Anderson described her husband as methodical and routine-oriented. Christopher followed the same schedule for years, opening his workshop at 8 in the morning and typically returning home by 7 in the evening. The days leading up to his disappearance had shown no deviation from this pattern, at least none that Catherine had noticed. She mentioned that Christopher seemed preoccupied with a particular project, one he described as potentially significant for his career, though he had been characteristically vague about the details. As Detective Mitchell and her team processed the scene, they discovered something that would become a crucial element of the investigation. Christopher's financial records, typically kept in meticulous order in his office filing cabinet, were missing. Bank statements, client invoices, and project contracts for the past 6 months had been removed. The filing cabinet showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting that whoever took the documents either had a key or had been granted access. The discovery sent the investigation in a new direction. Missing financial records implied premeditation, either by Christopher himself or by someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. It suggested that his disappearance might be connected to his business dealings, to money, or to a client relationship that had gone wrong. Detective Mitchell requested Christopher's bank records directly from his financial institutions. What those records would reveal would deepen the mystery considerably. But as the first week of the investigation drew to a close, one thing became clear. Christopher Anderson had not simply walked away from his life. Something had happened in that workshop. Something that left no trace except for the haunting absence of a man who had vanished from a locked room. And somewhere in that space filled with light-bending prisms and optical instruments, a secret waited to be discovered, one that would remain hidden for 33 years. The Portland Police Bureau dedicated significant resources to understanding Christopher Anderson's final days. Detective Sarah Mitchell assembled a team to conduct interviews, analyze evidence, and trace Christopher's movements during the week before his disappearance. Catherine Anderson sat in the interview room at the police station, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She had been married to Christopher for 22 years, and she insisted that nothing about his behavior had seemed alarming. Yet, as Detective Mitchell pressed for details, small inconsistencies began to emerge. Christopher had always been a private person, Catherine explained, especially regarding his work. He considered his optical techniques proprietary, part of what made him valuable to high-end collectors. But in the months before his disappearance, that privacy had intensified into secrecy. He began receiving phone calls at odd hours, conversations he would take in his home office with the door closed. When Catherine asked about these calls, Christopher would offer vague explanations about difficult clients or complex projects requiring international coordination. His sleep patterns had deteriorated as well. Catherine often woke in the middle of the night to find Christopher's side of the bed empty. She would discover him in his home office, surrounded by papers and sketches, working by lamplight. When confronted about his insomnia, Christopher attributed it to creative inspiration, claiming he needed to capture his ideas before they faded. The financial investigation revealed troubling patterns. Bank records showed that Christopher had withdrawn $15,000 in cash over a 6-week period leading up to his disappearance. The withdrawals followed an unusual pattern, small amounts taken from different ATM locations across Portland, never enough to trigger automatic reporting requirements, but collectively representing a substantial sum. Detective Mitchell's team interviewed Christopher's professional contacts, a network of collectors, museum curators, and fellow optical specialists. Many described Christopher as brilliant but increasingly withdrawn. Richard Torres, a fellow Prism collector who had known Christopher for over a decade, mentioned that Christopher had become obsessed with a particular project in recent months. Christopher had hinted that he was working on something revolutionary, a technique for analyzing historical optical pieces that could verify authenticity in ways previously impossible. This revelation intrigued Detective Mitchell. The art and antiquities world was rife with forgeries and disputed provenance. An expert who could definitively authenticate valuable pieces would be in high demand, and such expertise could generate both significant income and dangerous attention. The investigation expanded to examine Christopher's client list. His appointment book, found in the workshop, contained entries for numerous consultations and projects. Most were routine, assessments of antique optical instruments or custom prism orders. But several entries stood out. They were marked only with initials and times, no names or contact information. The most recent of these cryptic appointments was scheduled for May 13th, the day after Christopher was last seen. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A postal worker who serviced the industrial district remembered delivering several packages to Christopher's workshop in the weeks before his disappearance. The packages had come from international locations, Germany, France, and England. This was unusual because Christopher typically received domestic shipments of optical materials from American suppliers. Customs records confirmed the deliveries. The packages contained specialized optical equipment, precision measuring tools, and materials not commonly available in the United States. The purchases suggested Christopher was preparing for a complex project, one requiring resources beyond his normal work. Detective Mitchell's team canvassed the industrial neighborhood more thoroughly. Most businesses in the area were small manufacturing operations or warehouses, places where people minded their own business. But one witness came forward with information that shifted the investigation's trajectory. Marcus Hayes, who operated a metalworking shop 3 buildings down from Christopher's workshop, recalled seeing an unfamiliar vehicle parked near Christopher's entrance on multiple occasions during April and early May. The vehicle was a dark sedan, possibly black or navy blue, always parked in the same spot. Marcus noticed it because parking was limited in the area, and the car would occupy the space for hours at a time, sometimes appearing late in the evening. Marcus could not identify the make or model with certainty, and he had never seen the driver clearly. But he was certain the vehicle did not belong to anyone who regularly worked in the area. The last time he saw it was on the evening of May 12th, the night Christopher disappeared. This information prompted Detective Mitchell to request a comprehensive search of Christopher's workshop. The initial processing had focused on obvious evidence, signs of struggle, fingerprints, and the missing financial records. Now, investigators returned to examine the space more carefully. During this second search, a detective noticed something peculiar about the workshop's concrete floor. In the back corner of the main workspace, faint drag marks scored the surface. The marks suggested that something heavy had been moved, scraped across the floor toward the rear exit. The exit door, which opened onto a small loading area, had been locked from the inside when police first arrived, but it could be secured from outside with a key. More concerning was what investigators found when they examined the loading area behind the workshop. Tire tracks in the dirt indicated that a vehicle had recently backed up to the door, deep impressions suggesting a heavy load. The tracks did not match Christopher's vehicle. As Detective Mitchell reviewed the accumulated evidence, a theory began to form. Christopher had been involved in something that required secrecy, substantial cash, specialized equipment, and late-night meetings with unidentified individuals. The missing financial records suggested someone wanted to hide the paper trail. The locked doors and absent personal effects indicated Christopher had not left voluntarily. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery came when investigators finally located Christopher's hidden record-keeping system. Concealed behind a false panel in his office desk, they found a small leather-bound notebook. The notebook contained pages of handwritten entries, dates, amounts, and cryptic references. The entries were written in a personal shorthand that would require time to decipher. What was immediately clear, however, was the tone of the final entries. The handwriting became increasingly erratic, the notes fragmented and anxious. The last entry, dated May 11th, contained 3 words that Detective Mitchell would not forget. They know everything. The investigation had revealed that Christopher Anderson was not simply a missing craftsman. He had been caught up in something that made him afraid, something that had ultimately led to his disappearance from a locked workshop on a spring night in Portland. And whoever they were, they had made certain that Christopher would not be found. Summer 1990, Portland, Oregon. The investigation into Christopher Anderson's disappearance had reached a critical juncture. The cryptic notebook discovered in his workshop became the focal point of Detective Sarah Mitchell's efforts to understand what had happened to the missing optical specialist. Cryptographers and handwriting analysts worked to decode Christopher's personal shorthand. The entries revealed a troubling narrative that had unfolded over several months. Christopher had been documenting transactions, not for legitimate optical work, but for authentication services provided to individuals he identified only by initials. The amounts listed were substantial, ranging from $5,000 to $20,000 per consultation. The notebook entries referenced specific dates when Christopher had examined objects described only as items, pieces, or acquisitions. He never named the objects directly, maintaining a deliberate vagueness that suggested he understood the sensitive nature of his work. But certain phrases recurred throughout the entries: provenance uncertain, origin documentation missing, and most tellingly, requested discretion regarding source. Detective Mitchell consulted with experts in art crime and antiquities trafficking. They confirmed her suspicions. Christopher had likely been authenticating historical optical instruments and related artifacts for collectors who could not or would not verify their acquisitions through legitimate channels. The Pacific Northwest had become an unexpected hub for antiquities smuggling in the late 1980s, with items entering the country through Canadian ports and making their way to wealthy collectors in California, Oregon, and Washington. The investigation took a darker turn when Mitchell's team traced some of Christopher's equipment purchases. The specialized tools he had acquired were not merely for assessment. They were calibrated for detailed forensic analysis, the kind used to detect minute inconsistencies in age, composition, and manufacturing technique. Christopher had essentially built a private authentication laboratory, one capable of exposing forgeries or confirming stolen pieces that museums and institutions worldwide had reported missing. Bank records revealed that Christopher had opened a separate safety deposit box at a different financial institution 3 months before his disappearance. When investigators obtained a warrant to access the box, they found it empty. The access log showed Christopher had visited the box on May 10th, just 2 days before he vanished. Whatever he had stored there, he had removed it shortly before his disappearance. Interviews with Christopher's limited social circle painted a picture of a man under increasing pressure. His daughter Jennifer, who was away at college during the time of his disappearance, recalled her last phone conversation with her father. Christopher had seemed distracted, repeatedly asking about her well-being and safety. When Jennifer inquired if something was wrong, Christopher had deflected, claiming only that he was involved in a complicated project that required his full attention. The mysterious dark sedan that Marcus Hayes had observed near Christopher's workshop became a priority lead. Detective Mitchell's team reviewed surveillance footage from businesses in the surrounding area. Most establishments had no cameras, but a convenience store 6 blocks away had captured intermittent footage of vehicles passing on the main thoroughfare. Investigators spent weeks reviewing grainy recordings, looking for the sedan. They found it. The vehicle appeared on footage from May 8th and again on May 12th, always traveling in the direction of Christopher's workshop during evening hours. The image quality prevented clear identification of the license plate or driver, but the vehicle was confirmed as a dark blue Lincoln Continental, a model year between 1985 and 1988. This discovery prompted a broader records search. Detective Mitchell requested registration information for all Lincoln Continentals matching that description in the Portland metropolitan area. The list contained 43 vehicles. Investigators began the painstaking process of tracking down each owner, looking for connections to Christopher, to the art world, or to antiquities dealing. One name on the list triggered immediate interest: David Morrison, a 42-year-old import-export businessman with an office in downtown Portland, owned a 1987 dark blue Lincoln Continental. Morrison's business ostensibly dealt with Asian textiles and decorative items, but customs records showed a pattern of high-value shipments from Europe, particularly from countries known for robust antiquities markets. Background checks revealed that Morrison had no criminal record, but his business associations raised questions. Several of his known contacts had been investigated, though never charged, in connection with art fraud and smuggling operations. Morrison maintained membership in several private collector societies and had attended auctions where disputed historical items had appeared. When detectives attempted to interview Morrison, they discovered he had left the country on May 20th, 8 days after Christopher's disappearance. Morrison had traveled to Switzerland, ostensibly for business, and had remained abroad for 6 weeks. His secretary provided documentation of scheduled meetings and business transactions, creating an alibi that was difficult to challenge directly. The investigation also uncovered something unexpected. An anonymous letter arrived at the Portland Police Bureau in late June 1990, postmarked from Seattle. The letter, composed of words cut from magazines in classic ransom note style, contained a brief message suggesting that Christopher Anderson had chosen to disappear, that he had taken payment for services rendered and decided to start a new life elsewhere. The letter implied that searching for Christopher was pointless and potentially dangerous for those who persisted. Forensic analysis of the letter provided few leads. The paper was common stock available at any office supply store. The adhesive used was standard glue stick. The magazines from which words were cut included national publications available at newsstands everywhere. Whoever had composed the letter had been careful to leave no traceable evidence. But the letter's existence confirmed one crucial fact. Someone was monitoring the investigation closely enough to know it was ongoing and considered it threatening enough to attempt misdirection. The suggestion that Christopher had left voluntarily contradicted every piece of evidence investigators had gathered. Christopher's character, his relationships, and his meticulous nature all argued against voluntary disappearance. As summer turned to fall, Detective Mitchell made one more significant discovery. Christopher's workshop had been accessed after his disappearance. The landlord of the building confirmed that someone had entered the space using a key on May 25th, nearly 2 weeks after Christopher vanished. The landlord had assumed it was Catherine Anderson, or perhaps a business associate cleaning out the workshop. But when questioned, Catherine insisted she had not visited the workshop after Christopher's disappearance. She found the space too painful to enter. Security deposits for the building showed that Christopher had provided 2 keys to the landlord when he originally leased the space, kept one for himself, and the other remained in the landlord's possession. But Christopher could have made copies. The question became, who else had access to Christopher's workshop, and what had they been looking for when they returned after his disappearance? The realization sent investigators back to the workshop one more time. They documented everything again, photographing and cataloging with fresh eyes. This time, they noticed something that had been overlooked in previous searches. Several of Christopher's most valuable prisms, pieces he had collected over decades, were missing from their display positions. Outlines in the dust on shelves showed where the prisms had once stood. The missing prisms raised a new theory. Perhaps Christopher had not been the victim of his business dealings at all. Perhaps he had discovered something, learned something through his authentication work that made him dangerous to powerful people. And perhaps those people had decided that Christopher Anderson needed to disappear permanently. What no one could have predicted was that Christopher himself had foreseen this possibility. And in the months before his death, he had created an insurance policy, a message encoded in light itself, one that would remain hidden until the precise moment when it could finally be revealed. March 2023, Portland, Oregon. 33 years had passed since Christopher Anderson walked into his workshop for the last time. The case had long since gone cold, relegated to unsolved files that investigators occasionally reviewed but no longer actively pursued. Catherine Anderson had passed away in 2021, never learning what happened to her husband. But the story was far from over. Jennifer Anderson, now 50 years old and working as an architect in Seattle, inherited her father's workshop following her mother's death. The building had remained under lease all these years, the rent paid from Catherine's estate as a kind of memorial to Christopher. Jennifer had visited the space only once since her father's disappearance, finding it too emotionally overwhelming to face the physical reminder of his absence. But practical matters eventually required attention. The building owner contacted Jennifer to inform her that the structure needed significant repairs and updates to meet current safety codes. Jennifer could either oversee the renovation or terminate the lease and allow the space to be repurposed. After considerable deliberation, Jennifer decided to renovate. Perhaps, she reasoned, transforming the workshop into something new would provide closure that the unsolved case had never offered. The renovation crew began work in early March. The project manager, Thomas Wright, had been briefed on the workshop's history. The disappearance of Christopher Anderson remained a local legend, one of those mysteries that Portland residents occasionally discussed when conversation turned to unsolved crimes. Thomas approached the project with appropriate sensitivity, understanding that the space held painful memories for the family. During the demolition phase, workers removing old drywall in the main workshop area noticed an irregularity in the wall structure. The framing seemed inconsistent with standard construction practices from the building's era. A closer inspection revealed that a section of wall had been modified, creating a cavity approximately 2 feet deep and 4 feet wide behind the surface layer. Thomas immediately contacted Jennifer, who drove to Portland that same day. What they discovered in the hidden compartment would reignite the investigation into Christopher Anderson's disappearance and finally provide answers to questions that had haunted the family for more than 3 decades. The cavity contained a sealed plastic container, the kind designed for long-term document storage. Inside, investigators found a comprehensive archive of Christopher's secret work. There were photographs of optical instruments, detailed analysis reports, and correspondence with individuals identified only by coded designations. But most significantly, there were records of authentications Christopher had performed on items that museums worldwide had reported stolen. Christopher had documented everything. Each piece he examined was photographed from multiple angles. His analysis notes described manufacturing techniques, material composition, and historical details that confirmed or refuted claimed provenance. In several cases, Christopher's notes indicated that he had informed the individuals presenting items that the pieces were reported stolen and that he could not ethically provide authentication. The archive also contained a separate journal, more personal than the coded notebook police had found in 1990. In this journal, Christopher wrote in clear language about his growing fear. He described how he had initially believed he was helping legitimate collectors verify acquisitions. But as months passed, he realized he was being used to provide scholarly cover for a sophisticated smuggling operation. Christopher's journal entries from late 1989 and early 1990 revealed his internal struggle. He felt trapped between his ethical obligations and very real threats to his safety and his family's well-being. Several entries referenced confrontations with David Morrison, the import-export businessman whom police had suspected but never charged in connection with Christopher's disappearance. According to Christopher's account, Morrison had recruited him through a seemingly innocent introduction at a collectors' society meeting. The initial projects were legitimate, or at least plausibly so. But gradually, Morrison had drawn Christopher deeper into the network, offering substantial payments and implying that refusal would have consequences. The journal described a specific incident in April 1990 when Christopher had refused to authenticate a Renaissance-era optical device that he recognized from an Interpol bulletin about items stolen from an Italian museum. Morrison's reaction had been threatening. Christopher wrote that Morrison had made veiled references to Christopher's daughter Jennifer, suggesting that uncooperative associates sometimes experienced family tragedies. This threat had terrified Christopher. He began planning his documentation project, creating the hidden archive as insurance. If anything happened to him, the evidence would eventually be found and the truth would be exposed. Christopher had designed the hiding place carefully, modifying the wall cavity during a period when he worked alone in the workshop on weekends. The modification was subtle enough to escape casual observation, but substantial enough to protect the documents for decades. But the archive contained something more, a detailed map and set of instructions. Christopher had created a contingency plan, recognizing that he might not survive to testify against Morrison and the smuggling network. The map indicated a location in Forest Park, a 5,000-acre wilderness area on the outskirts of Portland. The instructions were cryptic but clear in their intent. If anything happens to me, look here. Jennifer immediately contacted the Portland Police Bureau. The cold case unit assigned Detective Amanda Hayes to review the new evidence. Hayes was familiar with the Anderson case, having studied it during her training as an example of a complex disappearance investigation. The discovery of Christopher's archive represented an unprecedented breakthrough. Detective Hayes assembled a team that included forensic specialists, evidence technicians, and representatives from the FBI's art crime team. The federal involvement was warranted given the international scope of the smuggling operation Christopher's documents revealed. The archive provided evidence of trafficking in stolen cultural property, a federal offense with no statute of limitations. Analysis of Christopher's documents confirmed connections to several major art thefts from the 1980s. Items he had been asked to authenticate included pieces stolen from museums in France, Italy, and Germany. The smuggling network had been operating on a scale far larger than local investigators had suspected in 1990. The FBI cross-referenced Christopher's coded designations with known art criminals from the period. Several matches emerged, including individuals who had since been convicted of other antiquities crimes. But David Morrison's name appeared most frequently in Christopher's records. Morrison had apparently served as the network's primary intermediary in the Pacific Northwest, connecting European smugglers with wealthy American collectors willing to purchase items of questionable provenance. In early April 2023, a joint operation involving Portland police and federal agents executed search warrants at multiple locations connected to David Morrison. Now 75 years old and ostensibly retired from the import-export business, Morrison maintained a residence in the Portland suburbs and a vacation property on the Oregon coast. The searches yielded substantial evidence. Morrison had kept his own records, perhaps as insurance against former associates or as leverage in case of legal trouble. His files corroborated much of what Christopher had documented, confirming the existence of the smuggling network and Morrison's central role within it. But Morrison's records also contained something unexpected. Photographs taken inside Christopher Anderson's workshop in May 1990. The photos showed Christopher's workspace in disarray, equipment broken, and most tellingly, they showed Christopher himself, clearly visible in several frames. The images had been taken shortly before his death, preserved as a record of Morrison's crime or perhaps as a warning to others who might consider cooperation with authorities. The discovery of these photographs finally provided the evidence needed to bring charges against Morrison. but questions remained. Where was Christopher's body? What had happened during those final hours? And most intriguingly, what did Christopher's map of Forest Park indicate? Detective Hayes organized a search of the area Christopher had marked on his map. The location was remote, accessible only by hiking trails that wound through dense forest. It was the kind of place where something or someone could remain hidden indefinitely. As the search team prepared to enter Forest Park, equipped with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, Jennifer Anderson stood at the edge of the forest, finally ready to learn the complete truth about her father's fate. The answers were buried somewhere in those woods, waiting to be discovered after more than 3 decades of silence. And back in Christopher Anderson's workshop, sunlight streamed through the windows at an angle that occurred only once each year, striking the remaining prisms in a pattern that Christopher had carefully calculated long ago, a pattern that was about to reveal one final extraordinary message. April 15, 2023, Portland, Oregon. The investigation into Christopher Anderson's disappearance had reached a moment that seemed almost impossible. The convergence of careful planning, optical precision, and the simple passage of time. What Christopher had encoded into his workshop 33 years earlier was about to be revealed in a display of light that defied expectation. Jennifer Anderson stood in her father's renovated workshop alongside Detective Amanda Hayes and a team of specialists. The renovation work had been temporarily suspended following the discovery of Christopher's hidden archive. The space remained largely as it had been, though now with exposed wall cavities and construction materials scattered throughout. Workers had departed for the day, leaving the investigation team alone in the late afternoon light. The date was significant, though Jennifer had not initially understood why. April 15th marked the anniversary of Christopher's final journal entry, the last words he had written before his disappearance in May 1990. Christopher had noted the date specifically in his instructions, indicating that something important would occur in his workshop on this particular day, at this particular time. Dr. Patricia Wells, an optical physicist from Portland State University, had been consulted to interpret Christopher's technical notes about the prism arrangement. Christopher's instructions included precise calculations about solar angles, seasonal variations, and the specific positioning of prisms throughout the workshop. Dr. Wells had initially been skeptical that Christopher could have created anything meaningful with the limited equipment available in 1990. But as she studied his notes, her skepticism transformed into admiration for his ingenuity. Christopher had understood something fundamental about light and time. He knew that sunlight entering his workshop would strike at different angles throughout the year. By carefully positioning prisms at specific locations, he could create a phenomenon that would only become visible during a narrow window of time on one particular date annually. It was a message designed to remain hidden until circumstances aligned perfectly for its revelation. The team waited as afternoon advanced toward evening. Dr. Wells monitored the sun's position, checking calculations on her tablet against Christopher's handwritten notes. The solar angle was approaching the critical threshold. Around 5:47 p.m., according to Christopher's calculations, sunlight would enter through the workshop's western windows at precisely the angle needed to activate his optical arrangement. As the appointed time approached, Detective Hayes positioned investigators throughout the workshop to observe and document whatever occurred. Cameras were set up to record from multiple angles. Jennifer stood near the center of the space, where her father had spent countless hours crafting his optical creations, and where he had apparently spent his final months preparing a message that would transcend his own death. At 5:43 p.m., the quality of light in the workshop began to change. The low-angle sunlight streaming through the western windows took on the golden quality characteristic of approaching sunset. Dr. Abris. Wells gestured toward the prisms, still mounted on their original stands throughout the space. Several had been removed over the years, but enough remained to preserve Christopher's intended pattern. At 5:46 p.m., the first prism caught the sunlight. A beam of white light entered the crystal and emerged as a spectrum, a rainbow of separated colors that projected onto the workshop's eastern wall. Within seconds, another prism activated, then another. The workshop began filling with intersecting beams of colored light, each prism bending and separating the sunlight into its component wavelengths. But this was not random refraction. As more prisms engaged with the descending sunlight, a pattern emerged on the eastern wall. The colored beams were converging, their intersection points creating specific shapes. Dr. Wells moved closer to the wall, her expression transforming from professional interest to astonishment. The light pattern was forming numbers. The intersecting rainbow beams, carefully calibrated to appear only at this precise solar angle on this specific date, were painting coordinates onto the wall. The numbers materialized slowly as the sun's angle shifted, each second revealing more of Christopher's message. Jennifer watched in stunned silence as her father's ingenuity manifested before her eyes. Christopher had encoded geographic coordinates into light itself, creating a message that could not be found through conventional searches, that left no physical evidence to be destroyed or concealed, and that would automatically reveal itself on the anniversary of his final preparation. Detective Hayes photographed the coordinates as they appeared: 45.5428 degree N, 122.7693 degree W. The numbers glowed on the wall in bands of spectral color, red blending into orange, yellow merging with green, blue deepening into violet. The effect was beautiful and haunting, a message from beyond death delivered through the physics of light. Dr. Wells consulted mapping software on her tablet, inputting the coordinates as they fully materialized. The location corresponded to a section of Forest Park in northwest Portland, specifically an area within the Wildwood Trail system. The coordinates marked a point approximately 3 miles from the nearest trailhead, deep within the forest where the dense canopy would provide natural concealment. But the light message was not yet complete. As the sun continued its descent, additional prisms engaged. Below the coordinates, another pattern began forming. This arrangement was more complex, requiring several minutes to fully develop as the solar angle shifted through its critical range. Letters emerged in the rainbow light, spelled out in the same spectral bands: under the split oak. The message was specific, directing searchers not just to a general location, but to a particular landmark within the forest. Christopher had left nothing to chance in his final communication. The entire display lasted approximately 12 minutes, from the first prism activation to the final fading of the light message as the sun's angle passed beyond the critical threshold. Dr. Wells confirmed that the phenomenon would not repeat until the following year, on the same date, when the solar angle would once again align with Christopher's carefully positioned prisms. The implications were staggering. Christopher had known, or strongly suspected, that he would not survive to testify against David Morrison and the smuggling network. He had created multiple redundancies in his effort to ensure the truth would eventually emerge. The hidden archive provided documentary evidence of the crimes. The map in his journal indicated the general location. And now, the light message offered precise coordinates and a specific landmark. Detective Hayes immediately organized a search operation. Even though evening was approaching, the urgency of the discovery demanded immediate action. The Forest Park location would be secured overnight, with a full search team deployed at first light the following morning. But Hayes wanted to conduct a preliminary reconnaissance that evening, confirming that the coordinates led to an accessible location and that the Split Oak landmark could be identified. A small team, including Detective Hayes, Jennifer Anderson, and 2 evidence technicians, drove to the Forest Park trailhead nearest the coordinates. They equipped themselves with flashlights, GPS devices, and basic search equipment. The hike would take approximately 90 minutes each way, and they would be working in darkness for much of the return journey. The Wildwood Trail wound through dense forest, towering Douglas firs and western red cedars, creating a canopy that blocked much of the remaining daylight. The team followed their GPS coordinates, leaving the maintained trail to navigate through underbrush toward the specific location Christopher had encoded. As they approached the coordinates, Detective Hayes spotted it: a massive oak tree, split down the middle, with each half leaning in opposite directions. The tree had clearly been struck by lightning at some point in the distant past, the force of the strike cleaving the trunk into 2 distinct sections that had continued growing independently. It was a distinctive landmark, exactly the kind of feature that would remain identifiable for decades. The team approached cautiously, their flashlights illuminating the area around the split oak. The ground showed no obvious signs of disturbance, but 33 years of natural growth would have obscured most surface evidence. Fallen leaves, moss, and undergrowth covered everything in a thick organic layer. Detective Hayes made the decision to wait for the full search team and proper equipment. Disturbing the site in darkness with inadequate tools could compromise evidence. The location was documented, photographed, and marked with survey flags. 2 officers would maintain a watch overnight to ensure the site remained secure and undisturbed. As the team prepared to return to the trailhead, Jennifer lingered near the split oak. Her father had stood in this spot, or near it, 33 years ago. He had chosen this location for reasons she could only imagine, perhaps for its distinctiveness, perhaps for its isolation, perhaps simply because it was remote enough to keep a secret buried for decades. The hike back to the trailhead was conducted largely in silence, each team member absorbed in their own thoughts about what the morning might reveal. The light message had provided coordinates and a landmark. Christopher's journal had implied that critical evidence would be found at this location. But what exactly lay beneath the split oak remained unknown. That night, Jennifer Anderson could not sleep. She lay in her hotel room thinking about her father, about his brilliance and his fear, about the terrible position he had found himself in during those final months of his life. Christopher had been caught between his ethical principles and very real threats to his safety and his family's well-being. He had tried to find a way to expose the truth while protecting those he loved. The light message represented Christopher's final act of defiance against those who had silenced him. He had used his expertise in optics to create something that his killers could not anticipate or prevent. Even if they had searched the workshop thoroughly, even if they had dismantled every prism and optical instrument, they could not have discovered the message because the message did not exist as a physical object. It existed only as a potential, as a precise arrangement of glass and light that would reveal itself when the time was right. Morning came slowly. At dawn, a full search team assembled at the Forest Park trailhead. The team included forensic anthropologists, evidence technicians, and specialized cadaver detection dogs. Ground-penetrating radar equipment was transported to the site to scan beneath the surface before any excavation began. Detective Hayes led the team back to the split oak. In daylight, the location seemed less foreboding, though still deeply isolated. The nearest trail was over a quarter-mile away, and the dense forest muffled all sounds from the city below. It was a place where secrets could be kept indefinitely. The ground-penetrating radar scan began at mid-morning. Technicians moved the equipment in a grid pattern around the split oak, building a 3-dimensional image of what lay beneath the surface. The scans revealed an anomaly approximately 4 feet below ground level, an area where the soil density differed from the surrounding earth. Something had been buried there, and the disturbance pattern suggested it had occurred decades ago. The excavation began carefully, archaeologically. Forensic anthropologists supervised the removal of soil in measured layers, screening every bit of earth for potential evidence. Approximately 3 feet down, the team encountered fabric, deteriorated but still identifiable as a tarp or covering of some kind. Beneath the fabric, the excavation revealed what the investigation had sought for 33 years. Christopher Anderson had been found. His remains lay in a shallow grave beneath the split oak, positioned carefully and covered with the tarp before the burial was completed. Preliminary examination indicated no signs of trauma that would suggest a violent death, though full forensic analysis would be required to determine cause of death definitively. But Christopher's burial site contained something else, something the killers had apparently not known to remove. Near the remains, investigators found a sealed metal container, similar to the document storage box that had been hidden in the workshop wall cavity. This container had been buried with Christopher, positioned deliberately where it would be found if his grave was ever discovered. Detective Hayes carefully extracted the container and opened it on site under controlled conditions. Inside was a final message from Christopher Anderson, a handwritten letter addressed to his family and to law enforcement. The letter was dated May 12, 1990, the day of Christopher's disappearance. He had written it, knowing he might not survive the night. The letter was Christopher's complete confession and testimony. He detailed his involvement with David Morrison's smuggling network, the threats he had received, and his decision to document everything as evidence. Most significantly, Christopher named everyone involved in the operation, providing details about their roles, methods, and connections to international art crime networks. Christopher's letter also contained a personal message to Jennifer and Catherine, expressing his love and his regret that he had become involved in something so dangerous. He explained that he had tried to extract himself from the situation, but that Morrison had made clear that the only way out was death. Christopher had spent his final weeks preparing evidence that would bring down the entire network, even if he could not survive to testify personally. The discovery of Christopher's remains and his final testimony provided closure for Jennifer after 33 years of uncertainty, but it also opened a new phase of the investigation. Armed with Christopher's detailed accusations and the supporting evidence from his archives, law enforcement had everything needed to bring comprehensive charges against David Morrison and any remaining members of the smuggling network who were still alive and could be prosecuted. As the forensic team carefully excavated Christopher's remains for transport and proper examination, Detective Hayes stood beside Jennifer Anderson near the split oak. The investigation that had begun with a missing person report in May 1990 had finally reached its conclusion. Christopher Anderson would be laid to rest with dignity, his name cleared of any suspicion of voluntary abandonment, his courage and ingenuity acknowledged, and in his workshop, the prisms remained in their positions, ready to deliver their rainbow message again in 12 months' time. A perpetual reminder of a man who had used light itself to illuminate the truth and to ensure that even death could not silence his testimony against those who had destroyed him. The case was no longer cold. The truth had been revealed through patience, technology, and Christopher Anderson's remarkable final act. All that remained was to bring the full weight of justice against those who had believed they could hide their crimes forever in the shadows. May 2023, Portland, Oregon. The investigation into Christopher Anderson's death had transformed from a cold case into an active prosecution. The discovery of his remains beneath the split oak in Forest Park, combined with the comprehensive documentation he had left behind, provided prosecutors with an unprecedented foundation for bringing charges against those responsible for his death and the art smuggling operation he had exposed. Forensic examination of Christopher's remains confirmed what investigators had suspected. Toxicology analysis of tissue samples, remarkably preserved by the specific soil conditions at the burial site, revealed the presence of a powerful sedative. The concentration indicated that Christopher had been administered a lethal dose, enough to cause respiratory failure without leaving obvious signs of violence. The method was characteristic of professional criminals seeking to avoid evidence of a struggle. David Morrison was arrested at his Portland residence on May 3, 2023. The charges were extensive: first-degree murder, trafficking in stolen cultural property, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice. Additional federal charges were filed related to the interstate and international smuggling operation Morrison had directed for decades. Morrison's arrest sent ripples through the international art crime community. The documentation Christopher had compiled, combined with Morrison's own records seized during the search warrants, exposed a network that had operated for over 40 years. The smuggling operation had moved hundreds of stolen items from European museums and private collections into the hands of American collectors willing to pay premium prices for pieces they could never display publicly. Federal investigators from the FBI's art crime team coordinated with Interpol and law enforcement agencies in 6 countries to identify and recover stolen items that Morrison's network had trafficked. Christopher's authentication records proved invaluable in this process, as he had photographed and documented each piece he examined. Museums worldwide were able to identify items that had been stolen decades earlier and had long since been written off as permanently lost. The prosecution of David Morrison moved forward with unusual speed given the age of the case. The evidence was overwhelming, and Morrison's defense attorneys recognized that fighting the charges would be futile. Negotiations began regarding a potential plea agreement, though prosecutors were adamant that Morrison face substantial prison time for murder and art trafficking. During the investigation phase following Morrison's arrest, additional evidence emerged that filled in the final gaps in Christopher Anderson's story. Cell phone records from 1990, archived by telecommunications companies and never previously examined in connection with the case, showed that Morrison had called Christopher's workshop multiple times on May 12th. The last call occurred at 8:47 p.m., approximately 1 hour before neighbors reported seeing lights go dark in the workshop. Investigators theorized that Morrison had arranged a final meeting with Christopher on the pretext of discussing authentication of another piece. When Christopher arrived, Morrison had administered the sedative, perhaps through a drugged drink offered during their conversation. Christopher would have lost consciousness quickly, never knowing that his elaborate preparations, his hidden archives, his coded light message would ultimately expose the truth he had died trying to reveal. Morrison's transportation of Christopher's body to Forest Park had been carefully planned. The burial site was remote enough to avoid discovery, but accessible by vehicle via fire roads that were rarely patrolled. Morrison had likely scouted the location in advance, identifying the split oak as a distinctive landmark should he ever need to relocate the remains. What Morrison could not have anticipated was that Christopher himself would identify the same landmark in his final message, turning Morrison's careful planning into evidence of his guilt. The metal container buried with Christopher's body contained one more revelation that investigators had initially overlooked. Among Christopher's final letter was a list of collectors who had knowingly purchased stolen items through Morrison's network. These individuals represented some of the wealthiest and most respected members of Portland and Seattle society, people whose public personas as patrons of the arts masked their private willingness to acquire pieces of dubious provenance. This list created a dilemma for prosecutors. Many of the named collectors were elderly, some had already passed away, and building cases against them would be complicated by questions of what they had known about the item's origins. However, several names on Christopher's list belonged to individuals who had since donated their collections to museums, institutions that had unknowingly accepted stolen property into their permanent holdings. The revelation led to a series of quiet negotiations. Museums agreed to cooperate with the return of stolen items to their rightful owners in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Collectors or their estates who still possessed items identified in Christopher's documentation faced civil forfeiture proceedings. The goal was not punishment of secondary parties, but recovery of cultural property and justice for the crime at the heart of the case: Christopher Anderson's murder. In September 2023, David Morrison appeared in court to enter his plea. The courtroom was filled with reporters, art crime specialists, and representatives from museums that had been victimized by the smuggling network Morrison had directed. Jennifer Anderson sat in the front row, finally able to face the man who had destroyed her father. Morrison pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole. At 75 years old, the sentence effectively meant Morrison would die in prison. The plea agreement included Morrison's cooperation in identifying remaining stolen items and providing testimony about other members of the smuggling network who might still be alive and subject to prosecution. The judge's statement during sentencing acknowledged the unusual circumstances of the case. Christopher Anderson's murder had gone unsolved for 33 years, the judge noted. Not because investigators had failed in their duties, but because Morrison had executed the crime with calculation and had benefit of luck in the initial investigation's inability to connect him definitively to Christopher's disappearance. But the judge also noted that Christopher himself had ensured his killer would eventually be brought to justice. Through his documentation, his hidden archives, and most remarkably through his encoded light message, Christopher had created a web of evidence that time could not erase. The judge described Christopher's final preparations as an act of extraordinary courage and ingenuity, the work of a man who knew he was in mortal danger, but who was determined to protect others and expose the criminal network that had ensnared him. Morrison showed no emotion during sentencing. He was remanded to custody and transported to the Federal Correctional Facility, where he would spend the remainder of his life. For investigators who had worked the case, there was satisfaction in the resolution, but also frustration at the 33 years that had passed before justice could be achieved. Detective Amanda Hayes reflected on the investigation's resolution during a press conference following Morrison's sentencing. She acknowledged the work of the original investigators in 1990, particularly Detective Sarah Mitchell, who had retired years earlier but who had been present in court to witness Morrison's conviction. The case had haunted Mitchell throughout her career, and seeing it resolved provided a measure of peace. Hayes emphasized the role that advancing technology had played in solving the case. Forensic techniques available in 2023 had allowed investigators to extract and analyze evidence that would have been impossible to process in 1990. DNA analysis, toxicology testing, and digital forensics had all contributed to building the case against Morrison. But Hayes also noted that the most crucial evidence had come from Christopher Anderson himself, from his foresight and his determination to leave behind a record that would survive his death. The light message in Christopher's workshop became a focal point of media coverage. Dr. Patricia Wells, the optical physicist who had helped interpret Christopher's calculations, described the phenomenon in interviews as one of the most sophisticated applications of practical optics she had encountered. Christopher had essentially created a time-released message using the Earth's rotation and the changing position of the Sun throughout the year to activate his prism arrangement at precisely the right moment. Dr. Wells noted that Christopher's design required not only expertise in optics, but also knowledge of astronomy, geometry, and architectural positioning. He had to account for the workshop's exact latitude and longitude, the height and angle of the windows, the gradual shift in solar declination throughout the year, and the specific refractive properties of each prism he positioned. The message worked because Christopher had understood and controlled every variable in a complex system of light and time. The workshop itself became a subject of preservation efforts. Jennifer Anderson donated the space to the Pacific Northwest Art Crime Research Center, a newly established organization dedicated to studying art theft, forgery, and trafficking. The workshop would be maintained as both a museum and a research facility, with Christopher's prism arrangement preserved in its original configuration. Once each year, on April 15th, the light message would be displayed for visitors, a memorial to Christopher Anderson, and a reminder of the power of truth to transcend even death. The recovery of stolen items continued for months after Morrison's conviction. Pieces that had been missing for decades were returned to museums in Italy, France, Germany, and England. Curators who had long since given up hope of recovering these objects found themselves reunited with parts of their collections they had considered lost forever. Christopher's authentication records provided the documentation needed to confirm provenance and facilitate returns. The financial impact of the case was substantial. Assets seized from Morrison and from collectors who had knowingly purchased stolen items totaled over $40 million. These funds were used to compensate museums for losses they had sustained and to support art crime investigation units in law enforcement agencies that had participated in the case. For Jennifer Anderson, the resolution of her father's case brought a mix of emotions. Relief at finally knowing what had happened competed with renewed grief at the confirmation of Christopher's death. But Jennifer found solace in understanding the courage her father had shown in his final months. He had not been a passive victim, but an active opponent of the criminal network that had threatened him. Jennifer arranged for Christopher's remains to be interred in a ceremony that honored his life and his final sacrifice. The service was attended by law enforcement officials, optical specialists, museum representatives, and members of the Portland community who had been touched by Christopher's story. His grave marker included an inscription that Jennifer had chosen carefully. He bent light to reveal truth. Catherine Anderson's grave in the same cemetery had been prepared with space beside it for Christopher. The couple, separated by 33 years of mystery and uncertainty, were finally reunited. Jennifer placed a prism on her father's grave, positioned so that sunlight would occasionally cast rainbows across the marker, a small echo of the elaborate optical message that had brought closure to the case. The case's resolution had broader implications for art crime investigation. Law enforcement agencies worldwide studied Christopher's documentation methods and his approach to creating durable evidence. The concept of encoding information in environmental phenomena using light, sound, or other physical properties to create messages that activate under specific conditions became a subject of research in forensic science. Christopher Anderson's story was featured in documentaries, academic papers, and training materials for art crime investigators. His workshop became a pilgrimage site for those interested in unsolved mysteries and their resolution. The annual appearance of the light message drew visitors from around the world, people who wanted to witness firsthand the phenomenon that had helped solve a 33-year-old murder. In the months following Morrison's conviction, several other members of the smuggling network were identified and charged with related crimes. The network had been more extensive than initial investigations revealed, with connections to criminal organizations in Asia and South America, as well as Europe. Christopher's documentation provided leads that investigators would follow for years, gradually dismantling the infrastructure that had supported decades of cultural property theft. David Morrison died in federal prison in March 2025, less than 2 years after his conviction. He was 77 years old and had refused medical treatment for a terminal illness. Morrison never expressed remorse for Christopher's murder or for his role in the theft and trafficking of cultural treasures. He remained silent until the end, taking with him whatever additional knowledge he possessed about the full extent of the smuggling operation. Jennifer Anderson continued to administer the Christopher Anderson Memorial Workshop and Research Center. She established a scholarship fund for students studying optical physics and art conservation, fields that combined her father's interests and expertise. The center hosted annual symposiums on art crime, bringing together law enforcement, academics, and museum professionals to share knowledge and develop strategies for protecting cultural heritage. The split oak in Forest Park, where Christopher's remains had been discovered, was marked with a small plaque identifying it as a location of historical significance. The site became a quiet memorial, visited by those who wanted to pay respects to Christopher Anderson and to reflect on the case that had captivated public attention. Years after the case's resolution, Detective Amanda Hayes returned to Christopher's workshop on April 15th to witness the light message again. Standing in the space where Christopher had worked and where he had encoded his final testimony, Hayes reflected on the nature of justice and memory. Christopher Anderson had been dead for 33 years before his killer faced consequences, but the truth had survived because Christopher had found a way to preserve it against all attempts at concealment. The prisms caught the late afternoon sunlight as they had been designed to do. Colors spread across the walls, converging into coordinates and letters, a message from the past delivered through the physics of light. The rainbow pattern glowed briefly, brilliantly, before fading as the sun's angle shifted beyond the critical threshold. Hayes thought about all the cases that remained unsolved, all the families still waiting for answers, all the truths still buried in darkness. Christopher Anderson's case proved that persistence, ingenuity, and the advancement of technology could eventually illuminate even the most carefully hidden secrets. It was a message of hope for those still searching for justice, and a warning to those who believed their crimes could remain concealed forever. The light would always find a way through the darkness. Truth, like sunlight refracted through a prism, might be delayed but could never be permanently stopped. Christopher Anderson had understood this fundamental principle, and he had used his final days to encode it into reality, creating a message that would outlive him and ensure that his death, like his life, would serve the cause of truth and justice. The workshop fell silent again as the light message faded, but the prisms remained in position, waiting for the Earth's rotation to bring them once more into alignment with the sun, ready to deliver their testimony again and again, a perpetual reminder that some truths cannot be buried no matter how much time passes or how carefully they are concealed. Christopher Anderson's legacy endured not just in the resolution of his own case, but in the inspiration he provided to others facing darkness and danger. His story demonstrated that even in the face of death, it was possible to fight back, to create lasting testimony, and to ensure that justice, however delayed, would eventually prevail. The rainbow message was his final gift, a bridge of light spanning 33 years, connecting past to present, victim to justice, darkness to truth.